Alrighty, good evening, everyone. So happy to have you all here. It's great to be hosting you tonight. My name is Victoria Williams. I'm a program officer here at the Chicago Council. We are pleased to welcome our special guest for the evening, Peter Pomerance. His new book called "This Is Not Propaganda: Adventures in the War Against Reality" will be available for sale and signing after the program, just right over there by our partner, the bookseller. Before we begin, a few brief housekeeping points to share. We are on the record. We are live streaming. We always welcome your social media engagements. Use our hashtags, take pictures, post it up on social media, but we also encourage you to silence your phones. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the council. If you would like to learn more about council membership, we encourage you to speak to one of our young professional ambassadors all the way in the back, and they'd be happy to chat with you after the program. Today we'll be taking questions from in the room and from online. If you would like to submit your questions online, you can just open up your phone to your internet browser and type in ccga.live. And you can also vote on questions that you like so that we can take them during Q&A. But with that, it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker. Peter Pomerance is a senior fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He has testified on the challenges of information war to the U.S. House of Foreign Affairs Committee, U.S. Senate Relations Committee, and the U.K. Parliament Defense Select Committee. He has worked as a journalist and as a TV anchor in Russian media for over a decade in the 2000s. With that, I will return to moderate audience Q&A, but please join me in welcoming our speaker, Peter Pomerance.
Wow, what a crowd. I'm on a book tour, and the last place I was in Oakland, and it was a Presbyterian church in Oakland with 6 pensioners from the local book club. Which was actually really sweet, actually really, really sweet. You laugh, but some of the best events you do are little ones like that. But I'm almost intimidated. This is great. Thank you very much for that introduction. It was almost accurate, but you know, no doubt that's my fault for not communicating my background well enough. It also made me sound a little bit respectable, and it is true. I now, at the grand old age of 41, I do have a little think tank at the London School of Economics where we research disinformation campaigns across the world. And we do more than that. We work with media and public diplomacy and NGOs to counteract them as well, to a sort of laboratory of how we can reinvent media and save deliberative democracy. But I'll come back to that, because actually my roots are far less respectable. Actually, the first thing that I did, also, look, if I talk too fast in English, so you just tell me and I'll slow down. I've been told by many Americans that, you know, my accent is indecipherable, so let me know. So I started life after university doing maybe the most despicable, low, amoral thing out there. I was a reality show producer. I was not actually a TV anchor. That was the one inaccuracy in the description of me. I went to film school very romantically in Moscow, as it happens, and then instead of making great movies and becoming the new Tarkovsky, as maybe I had dreamt, I ended up working in Russia. My background's British, but I was sort of in Russia in my 20s, and I ended up working in Russia, and I ended up working in the TV entertainment industry, which was booming at the time. This is Putin's first term, early 2000s. And I ended up kind of doing really terrible things like helping bring stand-up comedy to Russia and helping bring docu-soaps, reality shows, all that kind of thing. I took the culture of Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Trotsky, and I gave it The Apprentice. I have to say, I didn't work on The Apprentice, but the company I worked for did, and the TV channel I worked for did, and many of my friends did. And The Apprentice played, obviously, a very big role in American political life as well. And a lot of reality show producers feel very guilty about that, I know. But in Russia, when my colleagues made the Russian version of The Apprentice, unlike here, They had a genuinely successful Russian businessman who hosted it. Not a con artist, like a real businessman. And it was very well made. Consultants came from sort of Britain and the US. You know, when you buy a TV format, they come and teach you how to make it, get the storylines right, the music, the camera work, everything was perfect, and it flopped. Because that's not how you make money in Russia. You know, you don't make money in Russia by having a brilliant business mind. If you have a brilliant business mind in Russia, chances are you go to the gulag. The audiences were like, this is not how you make money. You don't do these like stupid tests. You know, you become a minister and embezzle money, or you hire the mafia and, you know, whack someone. Other reality shows worked very well. Survivor, you know, Survivor, when you take people on a desert island and dump them there and they have to survive. Russian audiences loved that. They were like, oh, that's our historical experience. The gulag, people surviving through hardship, extreme experiences, top ratings. I think it's still going. But as I worked on these very, very flippant shows, I could also see around me, because I was in the middle of the Russian TV industry, a new kind of political propaganda model developing. It would later become authoritarian. In those years, it was something much weirder. I mean, Putin is sort of like, I don't know, Stalin is 80% violence and 20% propaganda. Putin's the opposite. He's 80% propaganda and 20% violence. And obviously propaganda had always had kind of this exalted role in the Soviet Union. Propagandists were sort of demigods. Their mission was not just to kind of, you know, be spin doctors or PR people. They were meant to transform society, build a new communist man. But the new propaganda that I was seeing, it had several kind of defining traits, which I went on to write a book about. And the book was called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which was my attempt in one line to capture the essence of it. And I suppose the main features were this very odd thing where politicians don't care if they're caught lying, and instead actually revel in the idea that they're throwing up a big middle finger to factuality. Very different from the Soviet Union, where they try to imitate, they try to sound respectable. Now you had a generation of politicians, Putin, but there were much more interesting ones like Zhirinovsky, who looked like these buffoons who reveled in the fact they didn't care about the facts. And this was also kind of a type of propaganda that wasn't trying to establish a utopia or a future, but instead kind of was full of misty, warped nostalgias, where instead of any clear ideology, you had kind of conspiracy theories as a way to explain the world. And this constant sense that language was kind of losing its meaning. So there were elections in Russia, but they were kind of fake elections. So the democratic language of elections seemed to be eroded. Or you had something called the Liberal Democratic Party, which was neither liberal nor democratic. You had the Communist Party, which were basically orthodox capitalist nationalists. I mean, all the parties and the political categories didn't have any meaning anymore. So I left Russia in 2010 and wrote this book. And kind of in the words of my naive self, I said, Russia's a bit too crazy for me. I want to go back to the West, which is messed up, but words have meaning. There's a rational political discourse. Parties represent clear things. And then I get to 2016, and all the phenomena that I had seen manifest themselves in Russia in the early 2000s, and actually they were already there in the 1990s, are suddenly all around me. Here, because obviously all the things I just listed are now, part and parcel of the current governments, both in America and where I live, London. And I started sort of to pinch myself, kind of this very strange sense of deja vu. And I asked my Russian friends, because a lot of Russians had left Moscow to come and live in London and New York, and I was like, are you getting this as well? They're like, yep, it's come over here now. And sort of my second book, this is not propaganda, it was sort of inspired by me trying to work out why had this strange future arrived in Russia first? What's really going on? Is this a global phenomenon? Is there something systemic going on? And what do we do about it? The book is not actually a Russia book, even though Russia kind of stalks its pages and is a leitmotif. I go all around the world trying to find kind of patterns and trying to work out what's happened with our information space, our political discourse. What are the roots of this? I go to the Philippines, to Mexico, to Belgrade, to China, I pass by the Middle East. I spend time in sort of stable democracies like Germany and unstable ones like Ukraine and America. And there's kind of some core theses that come out of this. I'm going to take a glug of tea. I'm very jet lagged, so I need this tea to keep on going. I'm ticking every cliche. And essentially, what I think is happening, you know, if I take out kind of the essential principles of what I discovered, is that the foundational building blocks and metaphors and principles that we had assumed would make up a healthy, deliberative, democratic information space have, if not collapsed, then certainly half tumbled down. So the idea of a marketplace of ideas, the idea that freedom of expression is always a healthy sign of democracy, that pluralism will lead to a robust debate, that there's a journalistic ideal out there that everybody cares about of objectivity and fairness and impartiality. And most important for me anyway, this idea that we could hold power accountable with the truth, which is kind of the essence of journalism. So some of these crises, I think, are technological. So the idea of a marketplace of ideas sort of depends on this notion, a bit like some metaphors about the financial market, that if you have enough rational choice, people will in the end choose the best information. From what I have seen, that metaphor is very much to be questioned now. In the book, I go to places like the Philippines, where you have the highest amount of social media use per head of population, where Facebook is wired into your phone. If you buy a cell phone, Facebook is your phone. And where propagandists have learnt to control society and to attack critics and to undermine the space where we can have a democratic debate, not by constricting the information space through censorship, but by flooding it with so much disinformation, so many, I'm going to use a bad term now academically, fake news sites, so many inauthentic campaigns, that people can't tell the difference anymore between what is true and what is false. And in this kind of murk, in this chaos, they reach for authoritarian strongmen who can guide them through it. The Philippines is a very powerful example, I think, because the Philippines, a little bit sort of like the Soviet Union and other places, was a place that, you know, had a regime in the mid-20th century that was a military dictatorship, which acted through censorship. And now, decades later, you have a new regime that is rehabilitating the old regime, celebrates the old military dictatorship, but does the opposite, and then attacks its critics and attacks opposition journalists through this. And when, you know, the opposition journalists say, hold on, you know, this is dreadful, you're telling all these lies about us. You're undermining faith in us by spreading whispering campaigns against us online. The regime just goes, but this is freedom of expression. This is what you always wanted. You always fought for this, you Democrats. And you can't prove that these bots and trolls have nothing to do with us. These are patriotic citizens online, concerned citizens and concerned businessmen, which is exactly the line the Kremlin uses when people talk about the now infamous and well-researched St. Petersburg troll farm. There's actually a very funny moment when a company affiliated to the troll farm that creates strange news, when its pages got started taken down by Facebook, they started going, but what about our First Amendment rights? You know, we have them too. There's something even more insidious, I think, that's happening. So in the sort of battles for democracy in the 20th century, we'd always sort of assume that, you know, the right to speak back at power imbued you with more rights and showed that you had rights. Yeah? The powerful will try to crush voices. In the book, I have a lot of flashbacks to the 20th century and to sort of how censorship worked in the 20th century into the Cold War. Now something else is happening. That connection between self-expression and self-empowerment has been undermined in a very subtle way. Because now you go on social media, even in China and Russia, and you can say, in China less so, but you can say a lot more than you used to be able to online, even in these countries. And in the West, you can say whatever you like online. Everybody can be a kind of, can say whatever they want and be a kind of like self-publishing declamatory engine online. But the more you speak, the more you leave information about yourself online, the more that information is turned into data, which is then given to data brokers, which is then used by spin doctors to manipulate you in ways much, much, much more subtle and much more fitted around you as an individual than the old top-down type of propaganda. That's a very, very big switch. Suddenly self-expression makes you more manipulatable. Is that a word, manipulatable? I think we're going to have manipulatable as a word now. And that deeply undermines so much of what was fought for in the 20th century. But even those are the kind of the technological crises. Because in the book, as I go deeper and deeper, I find that there's a much bigger cultural malaise at stake, especially when we come to this issue of why have facts stopped mattering to politicians? Why are politicians no longer ashamed when they're caught lying? Yeah. It's good to look at, a couple of concrete examples. The Soviet Union would lie quite a lot, but it would try to make its lies look like the truth. Yeah. Whether it was, Soviet leaders in the sort of 60s and 70s making these grand speeches about Soviet progress and, coming up with absolutely bizarre ways to prove that the economy was developing, even though it wasn't. They'd come up with very kind of convoluted economic theories to prove that actually it was doing well. Even its disinformation campaigns, had to have the air of factuality. So a very famous one, which some of you I'm sure have heard of, if not researched, was Operation Infection in 1980, when the Soviets basically planted a story across the world that the CIA was responsible for creating AIDS as a weapon to attack the Afro-American population. This is a story that was designed with a lot of patience and accuracy. I think some sort of almost genuine scientists in East Germany had to first present it at conferences. Then it was very carefully seeded in in newspapers in the Indian subcontinent. It slowly spread around the world. So every effort was made to make this blatant lie look like a fact. I think around 1987, during their first kind of bilateral meetings, the early ones, Reagan confronted Gorbachev with this, saying, what on earth are you doing? Can you stop doing this AIDS story? It was starting to become, a very damaging story. And Gorbachev, apparently, was appalled at this dreadful slur. How dare you say that the great scientific, objective Soviet Union would lie? Flash forward a few decades later, when Putin is on international TV telling the whole world there are no Russian soldiers in Crimea, and kind of like smirking as he does so. And then a few months later, awarding Russian soldiers and Russian media for having successfully annexed Crimea, he's not lying. That's something completely different. He's saying facts don't matter. He's like, I don't care about your facts. And of course, you have the same phenomenon here with a president, as I'm sure you know far better than I do, who just doesn't seem to care if he's caught lying. And we have now the same thing with Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who's twice been fired for lying as a journalist. And it doesn't seem to matter. So what's changed? Why did it matter then? And why does it not matter now? And even though I'd like to blame everything on Facebook, I don't think even they can quite, be held accountable for this. If anything, because I already saw this happening in the Russia of the early 2000s before social media was quite so dominant. So here's my kind of the thesis that I come up with in the book. During the 20th century, both of these systems, communism and democratic capitalism, were both steeped in Enlightenment ideas And they were both trying to prove a rational, evidence-based version of the future. I mean, communism, for all its many perversities, still claimed to be a scientific, objective theory of historical progress. That was the core idea. Democratic capitalism was obviously grounded in a bunch of stuff from the Enlightenment. I don't want to get into a huge discussion, but like something about John Locke. Adam Smith, whatever, all that stuff. But all pretty damn rational and kind of future-orientated. And I think when we think about, and so both these systems needed the evidence. They needed evidence to show they were achieving their two different, quite graspable ideas of the future. Therefore, factuality as a type of discourse was important to both of them. It was embedded in both of them. And facts are not very pleasant things. Facts tell us that facts says that one might be overweight, or that one isn't exercising enough, or that one is going to die. Facts are not nice. But they're very useful if you're trying to prove something. If you're building a bridge, suddenly even Donald Trump becomes really fact-based, when he's doing the plans for building a bridge. So you've got to show how you're going to do it. It's that simple. So I think that's the key, the connection between factual discourse and an idea of the future. Now, in Russia, obviously communism, the vestiges of any kind of imitation of its ideas falls apart in 89. By 93, for many people, not for everyone, but for a huge amount of people, the idea that democratic capitalism was a vehicle for progress had disappeared. The reforms, whatever you want to call them, were so disastrous and caused so much misery that the idea that this was kind of a story taking you somewhere had started to disappear. And so by the early 1990s, certainly by the mid-1990s, you have Russian spin doctors and propagandists and media heads and politicians thinking, how do they negotiate this new space? Certainly factuality isn't necessary anymore. If anything, there's a kind of libidinal release in saying, go away, facts. I want to say fuck off, but it's live streamed. But and saying, go away, glum reality. That was so weak. Saying beep, facts. There's a joy in that. What Putin or Zhirinovsky, who's really the great kind of forerunner of this kind of politics, and what Trump do, there's a massive pleasure in saying, I don't care about the facts. Almost, to be very pretentious, almost kind of like a denial of one's own mortality. That's as pretentious as I'll go. So they discover that. They discover nostalgia, which is the real kind of opposite to a future-based discussion. Becomes a much more kind of productive mode to work in. So by the late 1990s, Putin is promising to bring Russia off its knees, which obviously anticipates different kind of campaigns here and in Britain. And in order to kind of prove to myself that I wasn't imagining this, one of the interviews that I do in the book is with one of the first spin doctors that worked first with Yeltsin, then with Putin. And actually, I'll read to you a little bit from the interview, because you really confirmed for me this sense that I had that the future arrived first in Russia, because all the 20th century's models for the future had collapsed there first. And now we in the West were arriving at the same place, post-2008, post many other kind of disasters connected with our idea of how history is meant to develop. We've come to the same place. I first invented the idea of the Putin majority. One of his first spin doctors, Gleb Pavlovsky, told me when I still lived in Moscow, and then it appeared. It's a quote from him. The communist, do you want me to do a stupid Russian accent? The communist, no. Chernobyl has shown we don't need to do that. We don't need to do stupid Russian accents when reading Russian voices. But I've got to give him another voice. Why don't I make him talk like Stewie? The communist ideocracy was sluggish, but it was an ideological entity nonetheless, he said. Even up to the end, people could at least argue over the positives and negatives of communism. Now, a vacuum arose, requiring a new language. We were an absolutely blank canvas. We had, in a sense, to reinvent the principles of the political system as best as possible. The vision of a pretty future of freedom had fallen apart in the devastations of the early 1990s. Instead, the landscape was dotted with new micro-movements, making up their own terminology as they went along. National Bolsheviks, liberal Democrats who were actually conspiratorial nationalists, communists who were orthodox monarchists with social programs. When he polled the country, Pavlovsky found that Russians believed in contradictions that didn't fit into any old conceptions of left and right. Most believed in a strong state as long as it didn't involve itself in their personal lives. Soviet demographic categories like workers, collector farmers, and intelligentsia were useless to win elections. Pavlovsky experimented with a different approach to assembling an electorate. Instead of focusing on ideological arguments, he targeted different, often conflicting social groups and began to collect them like a Russian doll. It didn't matter what their opinions were, he just needed to gather enough of them. You collect them for a short period, literally for a moment, but so that they will all vote together for one purpose. To do this, you need to build a fairy tale that will be common to all of them. That fairy tale couldn't be a political ideology. The great ideas that had powered the collective notions of progress were dead. The disparate groups needed to be unified around a central emotion, a feeling powerful enough to unite them, yet vague enough to mean anything to anyone. So I'll skip the 1990s to the 2000 election when Pavlovsky helps create the Putin campaign. For the 2000 presidential election, Pavlovsky pulled together everyone who felt they had lost during the Yeltsin years, the left behind, and imbued them with the sense that this was their last chance to be winners. These were disparate segments of society that in Soviet times would have been on different sides of the barricades: teachers, secret service types, academics, soldiers, whom Pavlovsky would bundle together under the idea of the Putin majority. When Pavlovsky looks at the West today, he sees it going through the same changes Russia underwent in the 1990s, a delayed reaction to a similar crisis. The Cold War split global civilization into two alternative forms, both of which promised a better future. The Soviet Union undoubtedly lost, but then there appeared a strange Western utopia with no alternative. This utopia was ruled over by economic technocrats who could do no wrong, then that collapsed. In this identity and ideological flux, political campaigners in the West have ended up adopting strategies strikingly similar to Pavlovsky's. So in the book, I contrast how Pavlovsky worked in the 1990s with the Trump campaign, but even more with the Brexit campaign. And I talked to the digital head of the campaign, and it's remarkable to what extent he explains his craft in exactly the same way. Yeah? His job when he created the Brexit campaign was not to say it was about one thing. Yeah? Quite the opposite. He had to adopt, he thinks, something up to 70 different messages, targeted at completely different bits of the population, not fitting into any conception of left and right. Some campaigns are obvious: immigration, others a lot less so. The most popular ad he did was to prove that the EU is terrible for animal rights because it supports bullfighting. None of this has got anything to do with ideology. Bundle it together into a very vague notion of the people, what Pavlovsky called the Putin majority, and then seal it all with this utterly vague, wonderfully spongy phrase: take back control. So even down to the kind of small details of how political spin doctors have to approach this futureless present, Russia was going through the same stuff in the 1990s that we're going through now. That actually, I think, is why they're quite good at operating internationally. They've had more time to hone these techniques, to learn to talk to different groups and different voices, not to go for ideological control, but to sharpen polarization. So what are we going to do about all this? Because I do work in a think tank, and I create little reports with bullet points. So bullet point number one, I do think there is a role for regulation. But what kind of regulation? Because kind of as a response to the sort of situation I described in the Philippines, this kind of like floods of disinformation campaigns, also coming from abroad, from Russia, from Iran, from China. One response, especially in Europe and parts of Asia, has been to try to control content. Yeah? There's laws already in Germany, in France, one probably coming in Britain, who see this problem as a problem of needing to impose censorship. You know who that will make very, very happy? The Kremlin. Yeah? The Kremlin have long argued for an end to information flowing free across borders, and for what they call the imposition of internet sovereignty, which is a Chinese idea as well, basically legitimizing censorship. I know that in America that's less likely because you have the First Amendment. However, I do worry a little bit that as we grapple with the impact, or just with the presence of the Russian social media campaign here during 2016, which I've researched a lot, by framing it as a problem of meddling and interference, one is choosing a frame that the Kremlin is very comfortable with. Because within that language, there is already an implied criticism that information should flow freely across borders. Now, I do think regulation is necessary, but I don't think it can be framed in this censorious fashion. Apart from anything else, I don't think that's how the internet works. I really want to censor my mother-in-law. She talks nonsense all the time. This is live, isn't it? Oh no, going to get such a bollocking from my wife. But I can't, even if, it's just stupid, the idea that we could censor the billions and billions and billions and billions of pieces of content out there. It's ridiculous. It won't work. Even the Chinese can barely do it in China, and they have a totalitarian dictatorship. The regulation that we need is one that asks for more information, not less. Because at the moment we live in a world where we don't understand how the internet environment around us is shaped. We don't understand if something we see online is organic or is a coordinated, inauthentic campaign. We don't understand who's behind these very strange fake news sites that pop up everywhere. We don't understand why algorithms show us one thing and not another. This in itself is a form of censorship. We can't communicate with each other and have a genuine, deliberative conversation if we're like Prospero, we're like Caliban on Prospero's island in The Tempest, sort of surrounded by these kind of like ghouls of bots and trolls, not understanding how and why it's all being shaped. We don't understand which of our own data is used to influence us and how. So the regulation that we need has to radically transform the way the interface of the internet, apart from anything else. And it has to allow us to understand the means of production of how different pieces of content are targeted at us. And then, if the Russians are still creating deceptive campaigns, then yes, you could say, okay, you can't do this on our internet, because it's not transparent enough. Yeah? It's the deceptive behavior rather than the disinforming content which needs regulation. And that's the sort of regulation the Putins of this world will hate, and the Dutertes of this world will hate. That's the Philippine guy I briefly mentioned. Because they rely on being able to manipulate their own societies and other societies through deceptive behavior. Yeah? Through being able to, in Russia's case, bully their own tech companies to rig the algorithms so they do really show more pro-Kremlin news. The Trumpian fantasy, or maybe not fantasy, that Google rigs the algorithm to show less conservative news. That really does happen in Russia. The problem is, we don't even know if it happens here or not. I assume it doesn't happen because it's so untransparent. I don't know. We can't function as a society, as a democratic society, if the information space is full of murk and dark. But regulation can only do so much. Regulation can help even out the space and even out the competition. But the competition for what? I think we're going to need a new type of civic media, I assume, whose job every morning is going to be to look at the fractured nature of the information space and to try to build bridges between it. I mean, of all the big kind of principles and metaphors that we had for creating a democratic information space, maybe one of the biggest was the idea that pluralism will lead to robust debate, that pluralism is a priori good. But what we've seen instead is that a radical pluralism leads to polarization so intense that the shared reality for democratic debate breaks down. I mean, I think it's not coincidental that when the Kremlin does its campaigns here, its aim is to sharpen polarization. Not totalitarian ideological control, but making the polarization even worse. Sadly, the way the internet is designed rewards polarization. Yeah? The more extreme you are, the more angry you are, the more likes and shares that you'll get. So the whole system has been sort of devised by people who think like reality show producers. Yeah? So if we can't change the way incentives are structured on the internet, then we're going to have to need people who get up in the morning and heal those rifts. So there's a lot of the experiments that we do at the London School of Economics. Essentially, our methodology is very simple. Essentially, we use the same methodology as the Putins and the various propagandists. We also try to understand audiences. We also do a lot of focus groups. We also look at their social media behavior, but we do it in a very transparent way. We find what different groups have in common, whether in terms of values rather than attitudes or behaviors. And we try to create content that will generate a common discourse between them. We're doing that in places like Ukraine, and I hope to one day in the US as well. But this has to be done at scale. This has to be a new iteration of civil society. I don't see who else is going to fill this gap. But again, these are technological things, I suppose. They're not really this bigger question of what do you do? How do you construct any kind of conversation if facts don't matter, if there's no idea of the future? Again, I'm not, a Marx-like political philosopher who wants to introduce a new idea of the future and impose it on everyone. My background is in media, and I suppose for a long time I used media for entertainment and maybe a little bit of ill. But I think we can also use it to inspire exactly this kind of future-orientated conversation. Look at your debates right now. Yeah? They are structured really down to the really small points like a reality show. If you attack someone and name them, they get 45 seconds back. You get 45 seconds back. Everything is incentivized towards the kind of conflict that we used to engineer on a reality show set. Surprise, surprise, a reality show politician won with that format. Instead of that, we should be doing something that I've heard pioneered by journalists in Denmark and other places. Locking politicians into a conversation where they have to talk about the future, show how they can collaborate together on policy solutions, so encouraging cooperation straight away, then holding them to account as we move forward. Some people call this constructive journalism, but it has to be the whole philosophy of how we approach covering politics. And that's just a very small step. We can talk about some others. I better pause because I've been told to leave 20 minutes for questions. You were laughing at the start and you all became so serious by the end. I can tell more jokes in the questions.
Awesome. So we'll open it up to questions. I do want to remind you that if you did want to submit a question online, you could submit that at ccga.live. You can also vote for people's questions. We have microphones also in the room, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to get to you so that we can capture your question online. So the gentleman all the way in the back right there. Yep.
Hi. Very good talk. 2 points, but very quickly. First, I understand that the greatest insult in Russian is nikulturny. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but would you describe our current occupant as that? And second, I understand that they are spending millions of dollars to go back and look through the online records of people who have dared to criticize the current occupant and the current political party and find bad details in their lives. Is this something that corresponds to what you've been talking about?
You mean in Russia or here? I'm always confused now.
In the United States,
Oh, wow.
The Republican Party is using millions of dollars to find bad materials on people who dare to criticize them.
Mm-hmm. And then what? And then they can't get a job in the civil service or something? Didn't Elliot Abrams prove that's okay? Anyway, yes, let's go. In England, we take lots of questions and then answer the ones we like. That's why people are unhappy at our democracy.
It doesn't work like that in Chicago.
No, you guys are like, boom, I've got to...
Yep.
It's like a pitcher and batter. I've got to take everyone. Okay. So, niekulturny, interesting. Wow, so much to explore there. So niekulturny means somebody's a bit of a kind of a bit of an oaf and isn't very cultured. There's so much to unpack there and what that tells you about Russian kind of identities. And it can vary from somebody having a poor cultural education, which was one of the ways that the Russian intellectual elite would kind of like separate themselves away from the rest of society. Because if you live in one communal flat with everyone else, the way you become different is by knowing, the difference between Mandelstam's middle period and late middle period. I remember a friend of mine setting up a bar in Moscow and saying, we throw out anyone who doesn't understand the difference between a good and a bad rhyme, which would obviously change all the time. But you had to know how it's changing. So in a society that was enforceably kind of like, squished together, the intelligentsia would put up these massive kind of barbed wires of intellectual dexterity. But usually niekulturny doesn't mean that. It just means somebody like, puts their shoes on the table, farts in public, behaves like an normal English person, basically. But that's what they mean. It's kind of like oafish behavior. Is your current guy oafish? Yeah, look, something else has happened. I mean, there's a bigger thing going on here than that. What do Putin, Duterte, that's the Philippines guy, Johnson, Farage, Trump, Bolsonaro, what do they all have in common? It's really not ideology, Nostalgia is definitely a running motif. None of them have an idea of the future. But the other thing is their use of language. They all make jokes about private parts. These kind of jokes that we always associated with the carnival. Yeah? And reality show is really an extension of the carnival. The carnival being this kind of space where all the old norms are overturned, where the little guy is made king for a day, where you use this sexually explicit language all the time, yeah? In the great carnivals, Saturnalia, if you go even further back, there'd be processions with penises. Small ones, if it was in Trump's case, I guess. But bad joke. And they've taken on the language of the carnival, which is their way of saying, I'm of the people. We're rebels, all of us. Of course, they're not really rebels. They're actually elites dressed up as normal people. But that's kind of part of the energy that they've reclaimed. It's very interesting. Duterte, in the book, I go to a comedy club. And it's amazing. Duterte's language makes Trump look like a nun. I mean, it's so rude. I find it shocking. But he's using the language of comedy clubs. That's why people tap into it. So here's where it gets dangerous. Carnivals are great for one night. Because they show the order, they refresh our boring lives, they bring a bit of anarchy into our world. They're also dangerous times, because in the linguistic the linguistic vacuum and the political vacuum that they imply is also a moral vacuum. That's why carnivals would often end up with very bad places historically, with sort of rapes and murders. It's this like, rules-free world, which can also be very, very dangerous. Think about how many horror films are set at fun fairs. There's kind of this world of anarchy and chaos. That's great for a night in a stable society. When that becomes the norm, when that becomes the norm, that means kind of lawlessness and not having any norms becomes the everyday. So the linguistic kind of breaking of all codes implies a political and legal breaking of all codes. Now, in America, you have other forces pushing back against that, yeah? But somewhere like the Philippines, it's very, very obvious. Duterte creates this linguistic anarchy and a legal anarchy. And it's very, very dangerous when powerful people dress up as if they are of the carnival, pull on the mask, it's like a double mask, and then start to rule. My only question is this just a cycle that we're going through for kind of, a rules-based logic to return, or is this something permanent? This is what I can't tell. This might just be a moment that we need a moment of regeneration. I fear that once these guys are in, that they might be very hard to get rid of again. That was a very long answer to your question.
Awesome. We have a gentleman just over here to the side. That was a question.
Thank you. I enjoyed your first book too, by the way. In your talk, you seem to focus on the politicians and the media, but you don't really have much to say about the citizens. And I guess I take the role of citizen rate that pretty highly. I feel like we've become a little perhaps lazy or something in not pursuing the truth more vigorously, and we seem to accept what we're taking from the media at face value and not questioning things. And so I guess I'm wondering why in your mind is the role of the citizen not a little more prominent in this problem?
So there's a lot about the citizen. Look, this was a short talk, and I could only kind of get a few beats, and I was trying to kind of second guess what people here would find interesting. I could do the whole book from the point of view of citizens' movements. I have an Atlantic article which is about that. I can refer you to it. But the citizen. So look, there was always kind of a model that we had, which in propaganda theory is called, the propagandist and the propagandee, sort of the one giving the message and the one receiving the message, and that's the tension. Clearly, that's broken down. Even my mother-in-law is a propagandist now. Every time you like or share something, you're a propagandist yourself. So that line between, the influencer and the influenced, it's really become much, much more fuzzy. And the book is full of citizens' movements using the internet for good. And I'm going to go out there and use words like good and bad. But it's also part of a new kind of citizens' movement. So one of the big things I look at in the book is the story of Sergio Popovich. Sergio Popovich is an amazing guy. He was a kind of student revolutionary who helped unseat Slobodan Milosevic's dictatorship in Yugoslavia in 1999. And since then has created an NGO that trains people across the world to fight for non-violent revolution. So he trained activists from the color revolutions, the Arab Spring, and so on and so forth. So in the book, I spent quite a lot of time with far-right activists. And you know what they like to quote most of all? Sergio Popovich. We've taken all his principles. We're now the citizens fighting against the soft authoritarianism of the left. And they use his techniques and his language, liberal language, in order to get rid of all Muslims from Europe. And so even the way we kind of think about citizens and citizen engagement has really been kind of, hacked by the people who deep down really don't believe in a citizens type liberal democracy. They don't believe everyone is a citizen. So again, that's a bit of a crisis that we have to manage. In terms of believing things, no, I don't think it's about being clever. I think there's so many studies, even without the internet, that show that everybody's prone to confirmation bias. So it's not I don't think it's that simple. I don't think you can just say it's stupid clever. I don't think media literacy is going to be the solution to this either. So many studies over so many decades showing the smartest people will still choose the truth that fits their worldview when push comes to shove.
Great. I'll ask a question that's online, one of the most voted questions here. It says, is there a country you think is doing a good job of combating the spread of misinformation?
I do think the regulatory approach is key, and there is a very good new proposal by the French from Benoît Loutrel, who's a former Google guy who's become a civil servant, which is already a good sign because he understands the internet. Because a lot of the politicians trying to monitor the internet or think about how to regulate it don't understand it, as you could tell from like these farcical Zuckerman sessions in Congress and Senate. So because he's a Google guy, he gets it. He understands that the nub of the problem is not content. Yeah, the nub of the problem is the lack of transparency and us not understanding how these companies work and not understanding how the internet is shaped. And the regulation has to go down that path. I very much hope his ideas will win out because the other regulation in France has been much more short-termist. But I think everyone in the tiny specialist field of people who operate in this field, everyone thinks that proposal is the most optimistic one.
We have a lady just right here in the front, in the white, who wanted to ask a question.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I found it very interesting. So one thing that really struck out to me was that, because you said it multiple times, was that these politicians, they act as if facts don't matter. But then that made me think, what about the stories that have happened recently where the facts really did matter, and that I think, for example, the Kremlin with the recent arrest and then subsequent dropping of charges of Ivan Golunov, that was a case where I wouldn't necessarily say that the Kremlin was held accountable for their lies, but they most certainly did not get away with them. So what was your reaction to that? And do you think that sets some sort of perhaps positive precedent for the future?
So going back a few more steps. The protest movement, there was the big one in 2011-12 that Putin seemed genuinely scared of when hundreds of thousands came out into the streets of Russia. It was about democracy and more rights and dignity. But it had the best economists in the country, and they had like a plan for reforms. It was and they had a vision of Russia's future as well as a normal European country. Putin, when he had to counteract that, had to think of something bigger, and so he took advantage of what was happening in Ukraine to annex Crimea, and really gives this massive blast of nostalgia. And the language of the future disappears from Russian political discourse. Because any discourse about the future in Russia would mean economic reforms, and the system is set up in such a way that it can't reform. I mean, that's the way it just can't do it. Even if it wanted to, it can't do it. So that's the overall tension that's happening. It's very much between really kind of economic pragmatists talking about a really clear version of the future. I'm not talking about utopias. I'm just talking about like what to change in the health service, like really simple stuff. And Putin, who's just doing these waves of nostalgia. The Golunov thing, look, I don't know how many people know about this. A journalist was arrested in Moscow and then released. You've got to understand, Russia is not a sort of a pyramid-like structure. He was arrested by one group at the kind of Moscow city level. There's lots of people who want to attack that group. They're higher up. It's different clans fight against each other, and sometimes good appears in those battles. In my first book, I've got a couple of stories like that. I think it's great. I think what it showed is that, kind of civic solidarity, coming back to your point, is very, very important. If that hadn't happened, somebody on the other side wouldn't have known what to do with this. But sadly, in Russia, most things are different clans competing rather than suddenly the truth emerging, especially when it comes to the Russian justice system, which is not, what's that naff phrase that political scientists use? Rule by law, not rule of law. Yeah. I love political scientists. I'm at the LSE. They're everywhere. They're my friends.
Awesome. There was a gentleman that had his hand up over here. You have a watch on. I do, of course.
In terms of your method and applying it per country with so many systems, different civic engagement, in terms of even culture, did it change per country? Did you, through more experience, add different consistencies, or did you have a method at the beginning to kind of form your thesis?
You mean the stuff we're doing with working with local media to smooth polarization? Yeah? Look, we're only in the foothills of this. So we're doing some work in Ukraine. We did a project in Italy. I suppose what we're really looking for is a methodology that's cost-effective and sound and reliable. So it's a mix of social media analysis, offline focus groups, targeting content, and then panels. Trying to get that methodology right so that it's fairly usable. However, I would say, whether you're in the Philippines, or Italy, or Germany, or clearly here, or Ukraine, there are several kind of repeating themes. Yeah? One of them is hyperpolarization and the political tactic of sharpening polarization, not using total ideological control. Sort of self-scandalization. You have these politicians, whether it's Salvini or Trump, who create scandalous situations in order to entrench polarization. Our study in Italy was very interesting because Salvini, who's kind of the Trump of Italy, his main thing is immigration. And even as immigration was plummeting, he kept on saying so many scandalous things and creating scandalous situations that it kept at the top of the agenda and using that to sort of split society. So either you're with me and a patriot, or you're against me and you're a traitor. And it's amazing, I think, if we look at Israel, I think Netanyahu is probably doing something similar. Certainly in Hungary, Orban used the same approach. So everywhere, it's not about an ideological debate. It's about polarization as a tactic. So weirdly, I think there's a commonality there. I think there's commonalities, and not just in sort of what we used to think of as the West, but even further. And the other thing that keeps on coming up that we want to investigate much, much further, and that I wanted to talk about today, but I just didn't have enough time, is conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories which aren't just there to buttress an ideology. I mean, the Nazis and the Soviets had their own conspiracy theories, but they all kind of, they were there to prove that the bourgeoisie were behind everything or the Jews were behind everything. Here it's kind of a world view where the conspiracy theories are endless. Yeah? The catchphrase of the Russian version of Sean Hannity, basically, is a coincidence. I don't think so. And his TV show is just this balletic kind of, almost beautiful dance, beautiful demonic dance, as he kind of intertwines these endless conspiracy theories, which just leave you going, oh my God, I will never understand this world. This world is so complicated. Therefore, I can't change anything. Therefore, I need a strong leader to guide me. I think we see some of the same tactics used on some American channels with the same kind of outcome, that only a strong leader can bring us off our knees. So it's a use of conspiracies, not ideologically, but to undermine agency, undermine the sense that you can change something. And we see that everywhere, whether it's in the Philippines, in Italy, and even now in countries that we thought immune to this sort of discourse. So that's something we want to think about a lot more. There's always been some people who are into crazy stuff, but why are more mainstream audiences succumbing to these conspiracy theories? What is their kind of psychological effects, and how do you really counteract them? Because I don't think it'll be through fact-checking. I don't think it'll be about proving anything. I think one has to work with the psychological effects rather than the content.
Great. We have a young man over here that would like to ask a question.
Do you think young people, having grown up in the generation of the internet and the age of misinformation, are more able to see through the propaganda to find that bit of truth, or do you think they're more susceptible by being constantly surrounded by it?
So what do we mean by susceptible? Today's propaganda isn't trying to convince you of anything. It's trying to say that you will never find the truth. Yeah? It's promoting a relativism. Oh, there's no objectivity out there. We didn't get into the debates about whether the old journalistic virtues of impartiality, objectivity, accuracy is still possible. So they're not trying to convince you. They're trying to say you'll never find the truth. And in that murk, turns out you have very little agency. So I don't think it's a question of susceptibility. Actually, what we need is a little bit more trust. Yeah? I mean, we all know, the people who don't trust anything, I don't trust the mainstream media, end up believing in crazy stuff. What we need is to find, how do we generate trust in a conversation? And I don't know if there's more trust among younger people. Certainly, my colleague at the London School of Economics, Sophia Gaston, has done a lot of research about nostalgia throughout Western Europe. And it's the young people who are the most nostalgic. It's the young people who have the least idea of what kind of future there could be. That's one of the great paradoxes. So if we think that the main disease is nostalgia, then actually it's the young people who are convinced that somewhere before there was a great time and we live in a terrible time, we're going to be poorer than our parents, there's no future. They're much more susceptible. I mean, they're not susceptible. That nostalgic discourse is more present among them. I don't know if it's the same in the US, but this was something that she found in Germany, France, and Britain.
Great. Well, that is all the time that we have today. Please join me in thanking Peter for being here at the Chicago Council. And we encourage you to stick around. We have Peter's book for sale and for signing. Thank you so much for joining us.